12 million people, one night, one country that nobody saw coming, and the most powerful man in the world could not buy this kind of attention. While Washington was busy talking about itself, something extraordinary was happening 400 miles north of the border. Streets flooded, bars ran dry. A nation that had never, not once in its entire history, won a men's World Cup match, suddenly delivered the most dominant performance of the entire tournament. 6 goals, 0 conceded, and a global audience that stopped everything to watch. Here is what I need you to understand right now. This is not a sports story. This was never a sports story. This is a story about power, about perception, about which country the world decided to pay attention to, and which country got left behind. If you are not subscribed, do it right now, because this one moves fast. Let me give you the full picture, because without it, none of what happened makes sense. Go back to 2023. FIFA announces the most ambitious World Cup in history. 48 teams, 3 countries, 1 tournament. The United States, Canada, and Mexico would co-host the biggest sporting event on the planet. On paper, everyone knew who the star of the show was supposed to be: the United States. 16 host cities, the loudest stadiums, the biggest television deals, and a president who had already started attaching his name to the whole thing like it was a real estate project. Canada? Canada was an afterthought, a logistical necessity, a friendly neighbor that got a few slots on the schedule because the math worked out. Nobody was flying across an ocean to experience Toronto. Nobody was writing think pieces about Calgary's cultural moment. Canada was background. Canada was the quiet one standing next to the loud one at the party. And then something happened that nobody planned for. Canada qualified. For the first time in 40 years, the Canadian men's national team was going to play on home soil in a World Cup. And not just play, compete. The expectations were still low. Advance out of the group stage maybe. Make the fans proud. Don't embarrass yourself. But here's what I need you to hold on to, because this is the foundation of everything that follows. Canada did not just show up. Canada arrived. And the moment they did, the entire framing of this tournament began to shift in ways that no television executive, no political strategist, and no sports analyst fully anticipated. 3 countries entered this tournament with something to prove. Only one of them proved it in the first week, and it was not the one with the biggest stadium. June 19, 2026, Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada versus Qatar. A match that, on paper, looked like a formality. Qatar had already been eliminated. Canada needed a result. The football world was watching with mild curiosity at best. What happened next was not mild. It was not curious. It was a statement. 6 goals, 0 in return. Canada dismantled Qatar with a completeness that made the football world sit up straight. British media called it a thumping, French outlets called it a thrashing, and somewhere in the press boxes of Europe, journalists who had barely glanced at the Canadian fixture list suddenly started taking notes. But here is where I need you to pay close attention, because the scoreline was only the surface. Underneath it, 3 separate explosions were happening simultaneously. The first explosion was the numbers. 12 million people watched that match across all platforms throughout Canada. 12 million. For context, that is an enormous audience for a country of approximately 40 million people. Nearly 1 in 3 Canadians tuned in, watching their national team do something it had never done before in the modern era. The energy was not just in the stadium, it was everywhere. In living rooms, in bars, on streets that had no business being that loud on a Thursday night. The second explosion was international. Fans had traveled from Germany, from the United States, from countries that had no team playing in Vancouver that night. They came because the atmosphere had a reputation already. They stayed because the reputation turned out to be an understatement. One man interviewed outside Coronation Park in Toronto had flown in from Florida. He could have gone to Houston. He could have gone to New Jersey. He chose Toronto. And when asked why, he struggled to find the words. Not because there were no words, but because the feeling was bigger than words. The third explosion was economic. And this one matters in ways that go far beyond football. Bars along Granville Street in Vancouver reported selling in a single hour what they would typically sell across an entire week at all 7 of their locations combined. Restaurant owners described it as the greatest single trading day in their history, not their greatest sports night, their greatest day, ever. Streets that had been quiet for years were suddenly overwhelmed. The pedestrian zone on Granville, long debated and long underused, was finally functioning exactly as its architects had imagined. Now here is what I want you to hold in your mind as we go forward. 3 explosions. Sports, media, economy. All detonating at the same moment. All pointing in the same direction. And Washington, D.C. was not in that direction. Wait, because what I am about to show you next completely changes how you read everything that just happened. Now, wait, because here is where it gets interesting. Let me take you back to something that was said long before the first ball was kicked in this tournament. Donald Trump, in the months leading up to World Cup 2026, made it very clear that this was his moment, his tournament, his victory lap. The United States had fought hard to bring the World Cup back to North America, and in Trump's framing, that fight had his fingerprints all over it. He wanted the cameras. He wanted the headlines. He wanted the world looking at American stadiums, American cities, American greatness on the global stage. And then Canada scored 6 goals, and the world looked north instead. Here is the contrast I need you to sit with for a moment. The country with the largest economy on earth. The country with the most sophisticated media infrastructure ever assembled. The country whose sitting president had explicitly framed this tournament as a geopolitical showcase. That country was not the dominant story of the opening week. A country of 40 million people, whose men's team had not won a World Cup match in the modern era, whose cities were not expected to generate international headlines, whose prime minister had only recently taken office, that country was the story. Now, I want to be precise here because precision matters. I am not telling you that the United States failed. I am telling you something more specific and more interesting than that. I am telling you that Canada overperformed so dramatically and so visibly that it pulled the gravitational center of the tournament's narrative away from where everyone had assumed it would land. Some international observers noted that the atmosphere in certain American host cities felt, in their words, corporate, commercialized, processed. I want to flag that clearly as an observation from specific voices, not a universal verdict. But it is a characterization that circulated. And characterizations, true or not, shape perception. That is how soft power actually works. Meanwhile, Toronto felt electric, Vancouver felt alive, and foreign visitors who had traveled to experience the World Cup were sending the same message home, again and again and again. Canada was welcoming. Canada was diverse. Canada was genuinely, unexpectedly extraordinary. Here is the word that kept appearing in coverage: unexpectedly. Nobody expected this. Not the football analysts, not the tourism boards, not the political strategists in Ottawa or Washington. And that is precisely why it worked. Because the most powerful moments in geopolitics, just like the most powerful moments in sport, are the ones that arrive before anyone has time to build a defense against them. Here is what nobody is actually talking about. And this is the part that kept me up. Here is what the mainstream coverage is almost entirely missing. This was not spontaneous, not entirely. And understanding that changes everything about how you read this moment. Let me give you the first layer: soft power. Real soft power. Not the kind that gets discussed in academic papers that nobody reads. The kind that actually moves the needle on how nations perceive each other. Canada in 2026 is not operating in a vacuum. It is operating in a specific geopolitical context that makes this World Cup moment far more significant than a football result. For the better part of 2 years, Canada has been navigating an extraordinarily difficult relationship with the United States. Tariffs, trade pressure, public statements from Washington that ranged from dismissive to openly hostile toward Canadian sovereignty. The relationship between Ottawa and Washington has been, to put it diplomatically, strained. Mark Carney took office in that environment, and from his first weeks as Prime Minister, he pursued a very deliberate strategy. Canada needed to be seen differently, not as a dependent, not as a satellite, as a sovereign nation with its own identity, its own values, and its own place at the global table. He said this at the G7. He said this in bilateral meetings. He said this repeatedly and consistently. Now here is what I find genuinely fascinating. And I want to be transparent that this is analytical interpretation, not established fact. One way to read the World Cup moment is this: Carney spent months building a narrative about Canada's global relevance. And then 12 million people watched Canada score 6 goals, and the world showed up to Canadian cities and fell in love with them. And suddenly that narrative had proof of concept attached to it. You cannot manufacture that. You cannot schedule it. But you can create conditions where, if it happens, it lands on fertile ground. And that is exactly what appears to have occurred. The second layer is diversity. And I do not mean diversity as a political talking point. I mean it as a structural competitive advantage in the context of a global tournament. Toronto is, by measurable demographic data, one of the most ethnically diverse cities on the planet. Over 140 languages are spoken there. When a German fan lands in Toronto, he does not feel like a foreigner in someone else's country. He finds a neighborhood that feels familiar. He finds food he recognizes. He finds people who understand where he comes from. That is not an accident of history. That is decades of immigration policy and urban development producing a specific kind of city. And that specific kind of city turns out to be extraordinarily well suited to hosting the world. Compare that to the political atmosphere emanating from Washington during this same period. America First, as a governing philosophy, sends a very specific signal to international visitors. The signal is not always welcoming. Canada, by contrast, was radiating the opposite signal, and international visitors noticed. Again and again, in interviews, in social media posts, in coverage from European outlets, the word that appeared was welcoming. The third layer is timing, and this one is the most ruthless of all. The world's media was exhausted, genuinely exhausted. Years of political chaos, economic anxiety, and relentless conflict had left international audiences hungry for a story that felt clean, uncomplicated, joyful. Canada's victory arrived at precisely that moment. A small country, a historic win, cities full of strangers hugging each other. That is not just a sports story. That is a psychological release valve for a planet under pressure. And here's the thing about psychological release valves. Whoever provides them gets remembered. Warmly, deeply, in ways that outlast the event itself. That is what Canada captured last week. Not just attention, affection. And affection, in geopolitics, is worth more than almost anything money can buy. Let me bring this down to earth. Because everything I have described so far exists at the level of narrative and perception. And I know what some of you are thinking. That is all very interesting, but what does it actually mean? What does it mean in numbers? What does it mean for real people living real lives? Here is the macro picture first. Nation branding is not a soft concept. It is a financial one. When a country's global image improves, the downstream effects are measurable and they compound over time. Foreign direct investment increases, tourism revenues climb, export products carry a premium because they come from a place people feel positively about. Trade negotiators walk into rooms with more leverage because their counterparts have a favorable prior association with the country they represent. Canada is currently in the middle of renegotiating its economic relationships with multiple partners. The trade architecture of North America is under genuine stress, and into that environment, Canada has just injected something extraordinarily valuable: goodwill, at scale, in front of a global audience measured in the hundreds of millions. One way to interpret this, and I want to be clear this is analytical framing rather than established fact, is that every day Canada remains the dominant story of this tournament is a day its negotiating position improves in ways that never appear in any official document, but are absolutely felt in every room where decisions get made. Now let me zoom in, all the way in. If you are Canadian, this is what this moment means at the street level. Tourism dollars are not abstract. They flow into restaurants, hotels, transport, retail, entertainment. The hospitality industry in Vancouver and Toronto has been through extraordinarily difficult years. Pandemic closures, inflation, staffing shortages, and now in a single week, some of those businesses reported their greatest trading days in their entire history. That is not a talking point. That is payroll. That is rent. That is a small business owner who was 6 months from closing, suddenly looking at a completely different set of numbers. If you are watching this from outside Canada, here is why it matters to you. What you are witnessing is a case study in how a mid-sized nation can punch dramatically above its weight on the global stage without a military operation, without an economic shock, and without a single threatening word directed at anyone. Canada did this with stadiums and streets and the simple act of making people feel genuinely welcome. And if you are skeptical, I understand that. I hold that skepticism myself to some degree. A football tournament is temporary. Attention is fleeting. The question that nobody can answer yet is whether Canada has the strategic infrastructure to convert this moment into something durable. Because here is the uncomfortable truth underneath all the celebration. Winning the spotlight is one thing, keeping it is another thing entirely. And what happens next, both on the pitch and in the corridors of power in Ottawa, will determine whether this week becomes a turning point or simply a very good week. 3 scenarios, 3 very different futures, and I am going to walk you through all of them right now. And now it gets bigger. Because everything we have discussed so far, the scoreline, the atmosphere, the economic surge, the soft power moment, all of it exists within a single week. The tournament is not over, and what happens next will determine whether Canada's 2026 moment becomes a footnote or a turning point in how this country is understood by the world. 3 scenarios. Pay attention to all 3. Scenario 1. Canada keeps winning. Every additional match Canada survives in this tournament is another week of global media coverage. Another week of international fans arriving in Canadian cities. Another week of the world's cameras pointed north of the border. If Canada reaches the knockout rounds, the story does not just continue, it accelerates. The Cinderella narrative takes hold. The underdog that nobody believed in, winning on home soil, in a country that had never experienced anything like it. That story writes itself. And it writes itself in every language on earth. For Carney's government, each additional round is additional leverage, additional proof of concept, additional ammunition for every trade conversation, every diplomatic meeting, every moment where Canada needs the world to take it seriously. Scenario 2. The United States responds. Do not count Washington out. The American squad has talent. American host cities have resources. And American media, when fully mobilized around a single narrative, remains the most powerful storytelling machine on the planet. If the United States begins producing results on the pitch and compelling stories off it, the gravitational pull shifts back. This was always a competition for attention as much as for trophies, and attention is a zero-sum game. Scenario 3. The momentum breaks. Canada loses. Early. Badly. The tournament moves on, and the question becomes whether the goodwill generated in Week 1 has any structural staying power without the fuel of continued victory to sustain it. Moments are fragile. Perception is fragile. And without ongoing narrative reinforcement, even the most powerful cultural moments can fade faster than anyone expects. 3 scenarios, 1 tournament, and no way of knowing yet which path we are actually on. 3 scenarios. 3 completely different futures for Canada, for the balance of power in North America, and for what this tournament ultimately means when the final whistle blows. And here is the honest truth. I do not know which one plays out. Nobody does. Not yet. What I do know is this. The next 2 weeks will move fast, faster than most people are prepared for. And the difference between understanding what is happening and being confused by it comes down to one thing: being here before it happens. I am tracking every development, every result, every political reaction, every shift in the narrative. The moment this story changes direction, you will want to already be in the room. Subscribe now, hit the bell, tell one person who needs to understand what is actually happening in North America right now. Because this is not just about football. This is not just about Canada. This is about which version of this continent the world chooses to believe in.